Or what?
Welcome, folks. This is the State House Advisory Committee on June 29th. And this is our second meeting and trying to figure out how the legislature comes back together in the building in Montpelier come January. That is really our first goal and our first item of working. The next item that we will approach later on is overall State House space. But of eminent concern right now is how do we come back as a legislative body come January? And how do we approach our workspace? And it's difficult to figure out what to really do because we're planning really for the unknown. We know what the world was like pre-COVID. We just trying to figure out what the world is going to be like post-COVID. And we know post-COVID, we don't want to always be on Zoom, but Zoom is a tool. And how do we balance that with how the legislature operates, which is in person and making social contact, social relationships, and working relationships are so important to the integrity of our General Assembly of government here in Vermont. So that's a tough lift for us. So that being said, any questions? We're going to have some folks who are here to testify. We have with us, I'm going to start with our Legislative Counsel, Michael O'Grady. Is he on? There were some questions that I posed to Michael in terms of listening to our conversation that occurred last week. We did have the results of the airflow analysis that BGS did back in the spring. We don't have within the state standards for our airflow, but we are looking at the national standard of ASHRA. So one of the questions is before us as a committee, do we abide by those ASHRA standards? And what are those implications? If we don't abide by that, what are the implications? And if we don't abide by the ASHRA, how much do we deviate? That's one decision arena that we really need to grapple with that I've asked our legislative counsel about that. The other area is vaccinations and requiring people who enter the building to be vaccinated. And if they are not, what's the implication of that? And I've asked again our legislative counsel to help us on that. Can we as a legislative body, as a government entity, as a third branch of government, ask people if they're vaccinated or not, and then not allow them to access their government? So those are two important questions that we as a committee have to vet. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Michael, and welcome.
Good afternoon. This is Mike O'Grady with Legislative Counsel. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. So generally, I am writing a memo in response to Representative Emmons' question about what air quality, indoor air quality requirements are required for the State House, whether or not the ASHRAE standard 62.1 applies and is required, and what other legal mandates or ramifications are subject, that the State House is subject to. I apologize, I don't have the memo completed. I have one outstanding issue I need to talk to the Department of Public Service about, but it should be completed by the end of the week. Generally, I can state that there are no generally applicable indoor air quality standards for the State House or state public buildings. A lot of people point to the Department of Health. The Department of Health does have something called screening values for air emissions, which is something that they use to determine whether or not additional action is necessary to protect health in a building, but it is not a generally applicable standard that a building needs to test for. Similarly, ANR has authority to respond to an air emission when there's an emission of a hazardous substance. But again, that's not a generally applicable standard. It's something that they respond to when there are discrete occurrences of a release. So the ANR and DOH really, they have some authority, but they're not generally applicable standards that apply to the quality of air inside the building. Now, Representative Emmons referenced ASHRAE 62.1. I want to talk about what ASHRAE and its colleague institute are. The American National Standards Institute and the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers, so ANSI and ASHRAE, they're private organizations. They adopt voluntary standards for multiple aspects of industry, business, or construction. ANSI or ASHRAE standards only become regulatory requirements when the state or another sub-jurisdiction adopt them for that jurisdiction. So ASHRAE is also a standard for the ventilation, or ASHRAE 62.1 is a standard for ventilation of acceptable air quality for heating, conditioning, and other ventilation equipment. So it's also not an ambient indoor air quality requirement. It's a requirement for the performance of the HVAC system. It does have as its standard or its purpose to provide the cleanest possible air for a building through the operation of the HVAC system. But it shouldn't be confused as something that provides standards for the level of a contaminant in the air. It is about the performance of the system and not necessarily the quality of the air. Its purpose is to maintain quality air, but it's not necessarily designed in the way that I think of it, of an air quality standard. And as I referenced earlier, they're voluntary unless they are adopted by a state or sub-jurisdiction as mandatory. They are not adopted as an air quality standard. They are adopted as the state commercial building energy standard. So the Department of Public Service, as required by statute, has adopted commercial building energy standards for Vermont. And a commercial building is basically any building that's not a residential building. So since the State House is not a residential building, it's most likely that the commercial building energy standards apply to it. However, the building energy standards only apply when there's new construction or major alteration to the building after 2007. So that's the first question. To my knowledge, there hasn't been major alteration to the State House since 2007. So the commercial building energy standards are not applicable right now to the State House. Now, if you were to go forward with the major renovation, it most likely would trigger the commercial building energy standards. And those standards are also incorporated into BGS design guidelines. Now, those design guidelines are general application practices for BGS projects, and they do allow for some deviation from those guidelines, but the commercial building energy standards, and specifically 62.1 for ventilation systems, is a requirement for new construction and major restoration or renovation under BGS design guidelines. So what does that mean? That means currently ASHRAE 62.1 and the standards for ventilation don't apply to the State House, in my opinion. They are not currently applicable requirements. However, if you undergo any major renovation or new construction, they will be required to apply under the commercial building energy standards and under BGS design guidelines. The question that's still outstanding for me is how they get enforced. They're a little ambiguous in their text as to who enforces them. They're not ambiguous in one respect, and it says that the Department of Public Service doesn't enforce the commercial building energy standards. It provides that the code authority or the other applicable authorizing agency is the one that enforces the commercial building energy standards. So to me, that sounds like the local planning and zoning entity is the one that has that authority. But there's definitely opportunity where a state building or a building in a town that doesn't have zoning and planning won't have that entity to approve compliance with the standards. That is the question I need to vet with the Department of Public Service. In those situations, how are those standards enforced? And that's the ongoing question that I have that I need to resolve for the memo. Now, what are the implications of not complying with the commercial building energy standards? The standards provide that before a development construction is occupied, before it can be used, it needs to be certified by that code authority or other authorizing agency in order to be occupied. If the standard continues not to be met, they can order stoppages in the construction. So it is a standard that needs to be complied with in order for occupancy and final construction of a building. The other question I need to figure out, if it's enforced under the local authority, could there potentially also be penalties for noncompliance? And I think there probably are, but I need to confirm that. So you don't have A&R air quality standards. You don't have DOH air quality standards. ASHRAE is not an ongoing indoor air quality standard that's applicable to you right now. If you do major construction or renovation, then it will be a ventilation performance standard for your heating, ventilation, and conditioning system. So what are you left with? You're left with VOSHA. Now, the Federal Occupational Safety and Health Act does not apply to state government and state legislatures. So what's called the general obligation in federal OSHA does not apply to you. But the state has its own general obligation standard. And what that general obligation standard says is that an employer shall provide an employee with a place which is free from recognized hazards that are causing or are likely to cause death or significant physical harm to his or her employees, and the employer shall comply with safety and health standards promulgated under the VOSHA code. So you've got an obligation to provide a safe working space free of known health hazards. Now, COVID is a known health hazard. What does that mean? Does that mean that you need to exclude everyone? I don't believe that does. When you look at OSHA, federal OSHA's guidance on what an employer can do to provide a safe working space, it provides mitigation measures, requiring people that are unvaccinated to wear masks, requiring safe distancing, requiring ventilation that you can provide to bring in outside air when possible. So there are things that you can do to provide for a safe working space that go beyond redoing or reconstructing or constructing the air ventilation system. I think that there are things that the State House has already done and things that it could probably continue to do, especially if you follow the OSHA guidance for what is a safe working space for an employer. Now, you also asked me what the legal ramifications may be if a person is exposed to COVID in the State House. If that person is an employee, then workers' compensation would apply. The state does carry workers' compensation insurance for its employees. And under the workers' compensation code, it is generally the only alternative remedy for an employee. And so that's what would cover an employee. I have some conjecture about non-employees. So workers' comp doesn't apply to non-employees. What could apply? Well, potentially tort law could apply, and more specifically a negligence claim, claiming that because the body has some duty of care to provide a safe public space. And if they fail to implement necessary measures, that they might be subject to a negligence claim. I think that's largely speculative. I don't know what duty of care that the State House has to the public beyond the general duty of care that a public building has. And for the most part, the State House complies with that. In addition, if you apply or implement mitigation measures similar to the OSHA Act recommendations, you're implementing additional safety measures, additional duties of additional care to prevent exposure. So for somebody to say that you breached a duty, I don't really see that. Plus, they're going to have to show that their presence in the State House led to their exposure, and that exposure cost them damages. I think that's going to be hard to do, especially if COVID returns to the rates it used to be present at in the state. So for an employee who's exposed and can prove that the exposure was at the State House and caused them some sickness, workers' compensation. For all others, I think they have a speculative tort law claim in negligence, which will be difficult for them to prove. So do you have any questions?
Questions? Joe?
Michael, the ASHRAE standards in the Senate committee rooms, as it's been explained to me, or at least as I've understood it, the ASHRAE standards can be met presently in the Senate committee rooms with an override. They cannot be met in the House committee rooms. In order to get that standard in the House committee rooms, as it's been explained to me, as I've perceived it, the HVAC system has to be upgraded either with new coils, which would not necessarily mean new construction, or with larger machinery, which might require new construction that would move a wall. I don't know if you know where they presently are located, but the bottom line is the courtyard in the middle of the complex, in between your offices and the State House proper. The expansion would have to take place either towards your offices or up. But is that major construction that would then trigger a new look at how things are being done?
Trigger the standards.
To get to the standards, would that construction alone, say if they went 10 feet towards your offices, does that constitute major construction as you've described?
I believe it would. I believe it more specifically falls under the BGS design guidelines. There might be an argument under ASHRAE's standard itself, or under the commercial building energy standards, I should say, that it might not constitute a major alteration, but I believe it would probably qualify for that as well. I would, love to hear the input of BGS on that question, because they most likely have looked at the redesign and what would be necessary for the installation of a new HVAC system.
I think they're still in the process of figuring that out. There's updated information.
So we have with us some BGS folks. We have with us Joe Asia, who we depend on a lot for construction information. So Joe?
Thank you. For the record, Joe Aja. For a major renovation, we actually defer to Vermont Fire Safety because they're the ones who actually have the permit process to determine that. So for what we would be putting forth, I don't believe that adding 150, 200 square feet of a bump out for the mechanical system would trigger that. For us, we'd be looking at, and for fire safety, it is looking at, I think it's more than 50% of the value of the building.
So if we're in the process of looking at our whole HVAC system, not just the House committee rooms with the override, So we don't know how we're going to approach renovating, upgrade, replacing our current HVAC system. Would any of that whole system replacement or upgrade trigger
It may.
ASHRAE standards?
It may, and would also depends on how far we get. You know, if we have to go through the House committee rooms, rip out some of the ceilings and the walls where the ductwork presently is, and to look at a potential future renovation or plan for that now, if we're going to have to tear out ceilings, we would look towards that. It still may not trigger it through fire safety, but we would know going through that we only want to do this once. And saying that at that point in time, we would look at, you know, greater insulation in the walls or ceilings may be required. We would look at that at the same time doing the design. So this planning process that we're now going through looks at that, and we're going to be coming out of that, the end of that study and saying, what do we need to do? If we need to replace all of the ductwork, and this is what has to be demolished and then rebuilt, what do we look at then? So it is too early to say that, but if it was to, not necessarily say a complete gut, but look at just even the house, 20s, 30s, and 40s, look at that section, we may only work to that area. And fire safety in the past has looked to that also and said, it's just confined to this area. So there are a lot of unknowns at this point, and until we really get in deeper into the study to see what that comes into play. It would be nice to meet the standards, but that could be, with the newer technology, be done with just changing out the air handler itself. We don't know that.
So if you look at the definition of alteration under the commercial building energy standards, it also includes a change in a building, electrical, gas, mechanical, or plumbing system that involves an extension, addition, or change to the arrangement, type, or purpose of the original installation. So I don't know enough about what is being proposed as an alternative, but that seems to me, from my understanding, to trigger what an alteration will be.
Yeah. So we're not even knowing how we're going to replace the HVAC system at this point. We're in the first stages of looking at that. Hopefully by the fall, we'll have some direction. So I think we have to really be careful here that we don't get so hung up on a new HVAC system that's going to take care of us come January. I think they're really, in a way, two separate issues. The HVAC system really comes more into play when we look at long-term space needs of the State House. But in terms of getting everyone back, having the legislature function in person versus Zoom, the HVAC system may not be in play.
It will not be.
It will not be in play. And I think we need to make that clear to our colleagues and to everyone, because I think there's an unrealistic expectation that you can change this out like you could change out your home pretty quickly. I think we as a committee need to be very clear on that, however we approach that. Allison?
So I think, however, it would help set expectations for what we need to deal with in the interim, whatever the interim is. So I think the plus of understanding that the HVAC system isn't going to be replaced overnight is that, you know, we hopefully by the time we go back, we'll have a notion of how long it's going to take, what the plan is. We'll have a better sense of all that. I think legislators will be very understanding, and the public and the lobbyists and everybody who uses that building and the staff, if we have a sense of how long we're having to hold our breath. I mean, how long are we going to deal with whatever creative options we come up with? I think people will be understanding as long as we know what we're working towards and what the timeline is and how long we have to make accommodations. And I think that applies not only to the HVAC system, but also to our decision about whether or not to move ahead with an expansion. And I think people will be much more understanding of the accommodations that are going to be required of us once we know what is coming and when.
Anthony, Butch?
This might be a sort of a simple comment, a simple idea, but aren't there units that could be placed in a committee room that would purify the air and increase airflow? I've seen them in doctor's offices and places like that where, it's like this thing, looks like a big microwave oven. It's not very big, but he's put it in the corner of the room and it increases air turnover, I guess. And
It does.
purifies the air.
There are
That's just as
units.
an interim measure in certain committee rooms.
There are units like that, and I believe the Sergeant at Arms had purchased some, and I know we have purchased some and have used them, and it's just a large fan that does circulate the air, so it blows out the top, sucks the air in off the side of the bottom, and then it is filtered. So it is only filtered. It's using the same air in the room. It does not provide fresh air.
Doesn't increase the airflow.
Correct.
So
So
but it's better than, I'm just saying, would that be a potential thing to consider?
It is, they're somewhat noisy.
that's
In
a
a
problem.
room like this, it would be noisier than the system you're hearing right now.
Right.
But it's not to say, it all depends what levels you're looking at. And I think the issues are still out there as to whether or not it is a benefit to be running it. It is a HEPA filter. It's a lot better filter that is on our air handling systems because it's down to 0.01 micron, I believe. And so it traps the very smallest particles. But you're still circulating all the air in the room, and it's really the fresh air that ASHRAE is looking, their standard is to be bringing in.
Right. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Thanks. So, understanding where we are today and where we would like to be in January, we do need to understand the future of our air handling system. But in reality, we're not going to do anything with the air handling system at this time other than try to improve the operations just because of time constraints, material constraints, all those types of things. So nothing Michael you have said scared me until we got to VOSHA. And you talked about we must provide a safe working place for our employees. I'm thinking our employees are more like the folks in your shop, Michael, and in JFO and Wedge Council, those area in operations. I still haven't figured out who I am an employee of yet, other than my constituents. So legislators may not be bound by that. Is that any type? It doesn't help for the other employees. And one of our options we have here is just to go back the way we were. And if we go back the way we were, we are. So anything maybe we move forward on is an improvement towards a better workspace. Should we just take that path?
Can I follow up on that and just ask this question, Michael? When we left the building, your opinion at that time that we were in an unsafe working space?
So I am not an industrial hygienist, so I can't necessarily make that conclusion for you. But the general standards for social distancing during COVID outbreak would have been difficult, in my opinion, to have met in some of those rooms.
I do understand that, Michael, but we are getting out of the narrative of COVID-19. We have to, because the science has brought us at least 83% of vaccinated population, and we can't redesign this building in the short term to meet COVID-19 standards. Absolutely impossible. You have to bulldoze it and begin over again. But prior to the introduction of COVID-19 into the world, I don't see an unsafe work environment. I see an uncomfortable work environment, but not unsafe. And tell me if I'm totally misreading pre-COVID inside that building.
So there definitely have been instances where there have been occurrences which may have been unsafe, but BGS has generally responded to them in a timely manner to address them appropriately. Whether or not that was the black mold and drafting operations or the other mold on the third floor of the house, or the mold in the speaker's office, or the air toxic emissions in the Pink Lady, which were above acceptable levels. There have been instances of of lack of safety, lack of an appropriate workplace, but BGS has generally responded appropriately. So those are discrete instances. Overall, I think you would have to make a case that it is a safe workplace, or you believe it's a safe workplace. You now have a airflow study that says certain buildings might not be a safe workplace. And now does that give you knowledge about how you need to respond in those areas?
So I'd like to have a better understanding of how employee is defined and how workplace is defined. Question that Butch raised are members, employees, number one, but also a question about, think of joint fiscal staff where the offices are in the Pink Lady, but they work in the building. Is there workspace in the building when they come over and work with our committee, or is the works, or just how is it defined? And
Sure. So let me just call up that it's 21 VSA 203. So an employee is any person engaged in service to an employer for wages, salary, or other compensation, excluding an independent contractor. And an employer is any person who employs one or more persons. So it's pretty clear that, in my opinion, the General Assembly staff offices are employees. Earlier, when Representative Shaw was referencing whether or not they are, the legislators are employees or not, I believe HR does designate you, each legislator, as an employee. And I believe you are all covered by the workers' compensation policy that the Department of Human Services or Human Resources carries for state employees. As to what is a workplace, it is specifically the term used as place of employment. And it's any place where an employee is engaged in performance of his or her work duties, or which is used in connection with an employee's employment. It includes structures, buildings, machinery, equipment, tools, appliances, materials used in connection with the employment. It also includes land and premises where an employer is carrying on any activity or business involving the use of one or more employees. So I don't believe it really matters if JFO is in the Pink Lady or in the State House. I think both places are their place of employment, because they're both where they're engaged in performance of his or her work duties.
And it almost sounds, Michael, like we as legislators are also subject to that because our workplace is the State House.
If you are considered an employee of the state, which I believe you are, but I can confirm with HR, and I believe you're covered by the workers' compensation policy, then the standard is likely going to apply to you, extend to your protection, as well as to what you may consider a traditional employee.
So if a member of the General Assembly contacts COVID and can prove that occurred in the State House, that member could file for workers' comp?
I believe so.
And just
Janet.
a quick follow-up, is there any difference in the duty of care to people who make their living in the State House, like a lobbyist and just a member of the public who happens to stop by, watch something that's going on?
So the duty of care only applies to the employee, right?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought when you were talking about the tort.
Right.
Oh.
It's well, right. That I think is a possibility. if a person was visiting the State House or needed to go to the State House to fulfill their employment as a lobbyist or an advocate or a state agency employee, and they were exposed and the exposure caused them damages, I think they have a potential claim for a tort. But then it comes to what is the duty of care that the General Assembly has for that person that's entering the State House or using it for their employment. I don't know what standard of care there is beyond the general standard of care for keeping a public building safe. And if the General Assembly is complying with that, and if they even go further and implement additional mitigation measures, I think there's a very good argument that the duty of care has been met. And then that person would need to show causation, and we all know that people are exposed to illnesses in the State House. We all know it happens. How you show that causation occurred, I don't know. Are there factual scenarios where it could happen? Yes, but I think it's a largely speculative argument. It's not impossible, but I think it would be hard to show a breach of the duty of care, and then it would be hard to show causation of damages from exposure in the State House.
John and then Jim.
I wanted to explore a little bit more when we talk about safe work environments. And it makes sense to me that it would apply for structural things, sanitation, toxins, that kind of stuff. But would these standards apply for infectious diseases? I don't really see how they really could, because unless you have a hospital situation where everyone is in protective clothing, a public building, no matter how good the sanitation is and the ventilation is, if you come face to face with someone with a cold or the flu, you're probably going to get it. So do these safe work environments include protection from infectious diseases? I would be surprised if they do.
So again, using COVID as an example and what OSHA has recommended as mitigation measures, there are things that can be done to mitigate, to increase the risk of a safe workplace. And there are guidelines that the federal OSHA has for I'm not going to get this right. I think they're called principal exposure levels, PELs, for exposure to specific discrete toxics. And so if you're following the measures to comply or mitigate the exposure or the transmission, I think you're providing a safe workplace for the standards of OSHA and OSHA. So
I'm not sure I follow though what those would be.
well, it's hold on a second. I don't have the link
Wouldn't be
up.
social separation and face masks in normal times.
I have it up. I can look at it, John.
So I can speak to this. So there are air quality standards that we have to abide by. So if we're over a certain level, no matter what that constituent is, right, then we have an obligation to go do an investigation, try to figure out why we're exceeding that level. So a really good one is, what is the gas that's around? Radon is a great example, right? So in Montpelier and Barrie, I think it's 1 out of every 3 homes has radon. And there is a level, right, which if you exceed that radon level, and those levels are set by VDH, there might be other folks that set levels too, but VDH is the one that sets radon levels for the state. So if you are above that, you have to take an action, right? Now, if I know that I have increased radon somewhere, let's say in my house, or in this case in the workplace, And I know I'm exceeding it. I've tested it, I've documented it. Now I have to come up with an action, right? I'm going to take an action to lower that amount of radon, right? And get it below that level that triggers I have to do something. If I know what's going on and I ignore it and I don't do anything about it, right? Now I'm creating a workplace that's unhealthy and I know about it because I've tested it, right? And I haven't taken any action to address it. I am now in a situation where the building in theory is not healthy and I haven't addressed whatever it is. Now at BGS, what we do is we do lots of air quality tests in all of our buildings, especially when somebody makes a claim that there's an air quality concern. We go in, we have somebody on staff that does most of this testing for us, and we also have private consultants. They go in, they do the testing based on what the concerns may be. We get the test result back, and then we know, do we take an action or not? Are we below a level or are we above it, above an action level? And then we have a duty to take an action. So that's how healthy buildings work for us at BGS. In terms of the workers' comp question, yes, for COVID-19 or any other type of exposure, if we know we're above it, right, someone can put in a workers' comp claim. Mold is another example. If you are in the workplace and you're exposed to mold and you feel that you get sick and you go to the doctor and they say, yep, you've likely been exposed to mold and you're demonstrating symptoms of mold exposure, yeah, an employee can put in for a workers' comp claim. And, it goes through the workers' comp process. Now, I have jurisdiction over state buildings and facilities in the state of Vermont. For me, and the way my employees work, it doesn't matter what building they're in, right? I have employees that work all over the state that go into multiple buildings. If you're in one of my buildings, regardless of what building you're in, I, right, as the owner, if you will, of these buildings, have an obligation to provide healthy buildings. So if I have a maintenance mechanic that goes into a different building and they get exposed over time to something, right, and we do the testing and he's starting to have sick symptoms, he can then put in a workers' comp claim. So what I guess I'm saying is I have an obligation to provide healthy buildings statewide.
We went
None of
through
that
this.
applies to infectious diseases. You can
COVID-19,
measure
you
mold
can-
spores, you can measure lead in the water, you can measure all kinds of stuff in the air, but none of that applies. to
COVID-19, you
infectious
can put in
diseases.
workers' comp claims for. The state has been doing that. And the way they figure out where the exposure occurred is they do contract tracing. And they determine where they believe the exposure has occurred and you can put in a workers' comp claim for it.
For how long is the question? Because I think we did it. It's got a time limit on it, the extension that we added to that. And I can't remember what it was, whether it was 6 months or it's not forever.
What you extended is the presumption,
Right.
That-
We extended
right.
the presumption for 6 months?
July 15th of this year.
Oh,
But Michael, that's a presumption that it was, that you
Right.
contracted COVID at work. You can still
Right.
prove it even after that presumption is over by
Correct.
using contact tracing, contact tracing,
Contact
and show that you got it at work and still qualify for workers' compensation. What we did was make it easier during the, to presume that's what happened.
Correct.
Yeah.
right.
None of this is really answering the question.
Maybe
So-
there is
so
no
I'm
answer to
about-
your question. Maybe there is no answer.
But it's
Your
like,
question.
is there a way to create a safe work environment that deals with infectious diseases?
If,
I'm about to say,
Michael has an answer.
Michael?
I'm about to send Mike Ferran an OSHA document on indoor air quality in commercial and institutional buildings. It's a little dated. It's from 2011, but it does address biological issues such as viruses. So I can send that on for your reference.
We can have that posted to our webpage.
If you'd like to, sure.
Joe and then Butch.
we have an obligation to come up with a recommendation by August 15th as to what we're supposed to be doing. We keep circling back to the narrative of COVID. If COVID raises its head, we know what the option is. We evacuate the building and we go back to remote. That's the only responsible thing that we can do. We also know we cannot perform construction prior to January 1st. So the real question in front of us is, what are we going to recommend on August 15th as to what we should do? I'm coming back to Janet Miller's 4 suggested options. The only option that I can see with some modifications is option 4. that we go back to doing business as normal with modifications. Creature comfort has got to become the main conversation point. We can't plan between now and January for every possible scenario, and we don't have the ability to simply bulldoze the building and start from scratch. We can shoot for creature comfort. If coils can be replaced in those HVAC systems and bring the committee rooms in the house up to ASHRAE standards, by all means, that should be an objective. Chairs can be instructed to evacuate their rooms on an hourly basis for a period of time to just get some of the airflow moving. But we're not going to be able to conquer infectious diseases at all, even the common cold, without saying this building is now officially history and we're moving somewhere else.
Well, in America, it's safe to say there is no place that's safe from infectious disease.
And I totally agree with you, Allison, but we have a limited time frame to make a recommendation. You've got to be concrete in that recommendation.
What you then, Ruth?
So, thanks, Alice. So Mike brought up, and I'm circling back to the VOSHA piece again. So I think that's that's the only standard that Mike pointed out to us that actually applies to us, I believe. But, and then I go back to Jennifer's conversation about knowing you have a problem and taking an action. The legislature clearly has determined that we have an air quality problem in the State House. We have allocated money to move forward on solving that problem. So, Michael, does that doesn't relieve us anything, but it does that create an action that we have identified a problem and are taking steps to correct the problem?
So let's talk about what the commissioner just said. She basically said that when there's been an identified discrete chemical, that they employ the Department of Health screening value to determine what action is necessary in order to mitigate the presence of that substance or to make the space safe, right? And so that's a screening value for a discrete substance. What you've learned from the airflow study doesn't relate to a discrete substance. It relates to whether or not the air has proper ventilation to bring in outdoor air. There is no screening value for that under the Department of Health's authority, to my knowledge. I don't believe there's one for the ASHRAE standard is basically to ensure the operation of your system to provide that healthy circulating air. But I don't know what obligation the state has to go into a room to test it and see it's properly circulating and to ensure that it's properly circulating. Does BGS address this issue in other buildings where there's potentially unhealthy air circulation?
When there's a complaint, we do. So somebody would have to put forth a complaint, but we do not randomly test. We rely on our systems as designed to provide the maximum amount of fresh air possible for that system as the design laid out for the whole building or the room area. So only during a complaint would we go and investigate to make sure that there was proper airflow.
Right, and that's consistent with how you've responded to certain incidents in the State House in the past. The one I'm thinking of most specifically is when the heating system, the radiator system, and the Pink Lady needed to be retrofitted, and prior to its retrofitting, there was off-gassing of a cleaning chemical from the system. And what you did is you came in and you put in airflow mitigation measures to try to bring as much outdoor air into those spaces to mitigate the potential substances that were in the air from the retrofitting of the heating system.
That is correct. We had to do that because of the time frame to get new radiators. So that's where we were able to put a system in to vent the existing radiator out the window or the sidewall. But that was a mitigation
That may have been triggered, that whole situation may have been triggered because we were upgrading our heating plant
Well,
in our tunnel.
that is true, is what happened.
Have triggered what then occurred at joint fiscal.
Yeah, we thought we had a closed system. We
Right.
actually had 2 buildings with open vents.
Right.
Right. So my question then becomes, is there a short-term airflow measure for those rooms where the ASHRAE airflow study or the Freeman French airflow study said that it was unhealthy underneath the current operation of the HVAC system? Can you retrofit those rooms to provide increased airflow that mitigates any potential health concern from the airflow underneath normal operating processes?
In the House, that is not possible. With the Senate side, we can override the system to bring in more fresh air. The House does not allow for that.
I also think it's important to acknowledge that airflow is not a standard, right? This is a best practice from ASHRAE that has not been adopted in the state of Vermont. And so if we use what Michael O'Grady has been saying, right, the question is that if it's not a VDH, right, where we have a particular constituent, if we're just talking about airflows and we have not adopted a standard, right, then it's a different conversation that we're having versus I have a known radon or something else, right, in the State House that I now have to deal with. We're talking about fresh air. So I feel like that's a different conversation and a different requirement. So I just want to make that clear what we're talking about.
That's what I was trying to say about changing the narrative.
Yep.
You use the term air quality. We don't have a measurement of air quality that has been negatively impacted. We know we have an airflow situation, but staying true to the narrative is critical for this committee's recommendations going forward. I know radon is considered air quality.
Correct.
It was remediated in my committee room. That was the worst committee room, along with the one Anthony was in across the hall. We don't have an air quality conversation going on here.
Correct.
We have an airflow conversation. We can make a recommendation that the first objective to reach is getting that airflow equivalent in the House to what the Senate currently has. That certainly is an objective, and it's certainly something we can recommend. But how do you do that and expect that it's going to happen before January? You can't.
So we have more questions here. So Ruth and then Janet.
Thank you. I have a specific question for you, and then I had a couple other points that I've kind of had in the hopper. So how many rooms are we talking about in the house part of the building?
I did not bring my airflow
I do.
We have that.
today.
And is it a thing that if it were fewer people in the room, it would be less of an issue? So it's, like if there are 10 people, it's okay, but if there are 20 people, it's not okay kind of thing? Yeah.
The maximum based on the airflow for each room.
Okay.
I believe we gave Representative Emmons on the baseline number, might have been the number of committee members. Trying to remember.
So I can just briefly go through, like House Judiciary, the room capacity is based on airflow. It's not air quality, it's air comfort. It's based for 7. House Education is 5. House Ag is 7. House Corrections is 7. House Ways and Means is 18.
Pile them in.
House Energy is 8. House Appropriations is 6. House Transportation is 15. House General is 8. Healthcare, 7. Human Services is 15.
So it's more than half of them. I mean, I was just trying to see, is it 3 rooms or is it
But then-
12 rooms or whatever?
then
Or is
you
it
look at
most
the
of them?
cafeteria.
It's almost all of them,
It's all of
yeah.
them.
Okay. So, okay, that's helpful to know because, yeah, okay. So my other thing is I hear you, Senator Benning, that you don't want to talk about COVID anymore because we all want to be past it. But I think that it's really important that if you look at the OSHA guidelines, they're pretty clear about what you have to do in a workplace even, and they were just updated in June. So they're pretty clear standards. And one of them is something I mentioned last time, which is encouraging vaccinations. And so I think it would be really helpful if whatever plan we come up with, we can at least encourage vaccinations. I mean, that's the entire state government has been doing that and saying, we encourage you to be vaccinated before you visit the State House. There will be unvaccinated people in the State House. There are some people who can't be vaccinated for medical reasons. And so we want to make sure they're protected. And then if we do allow student, fourth grade classes to come and visit before fourth graders can be vaccinated, that's another issue too. And so if they're able to be vaccinated, to say we encourage classes to be fully vaccinated before they come, and if they're not, then these are the mitigations. Just being really clear that we're trying to follow the OSHA standards, and we are publicly encouraging them and following them. So that's just one thing I want to say. Even whatever our plan is that we need to, even though we're mostly beyond COVID. It's still going to be an issue when we get back into our tiny little building. And then the other thing about what you were saying about getting to Janet's 4 options is one of the, and I talked with Stephen about this, her options don't actually include the whole possibility of using Aiken 2 and 4 and the opportunity that might provide. And so I wanted to ask Michael, because in my mind, one of the best options is to put legislative counsel there, but I don't want to presume that they want to go there. And so I don't know if you're prepared to speak about that, Michael, and if you have authority to speak on behalf of the whole office.
Hold on. We got a lot of things at play here, and we do have a structure to the meeting, and we are going to get.
Okay, it just seemed like we're trying to get to the options, and we haven't talked about that option yet.
The options are something we have to be careful we don't walk into any of that at this point, because we're not there. We're not there at all. I mean, suggestions, but we're not picking option today or next week. It's going to take some process.
Okay, well, that wasn't one of the 4 options. It wasn't even
Right, it wasn't
in the 4 options at
I
all.
mean, that was just a starting point for the conversation for that. So we've got a long ways to go to figure out what option or options. Second part, the vaccination, I've asked Michael to weigh in on that. What is our legal responsibility as a legislative body? Can we come out and ask people if they're vaccinated?
Right.
And can we prevent them from coming into the building or not? That's the next piece that I wanted to get into after this airflow. And then the third piece of our agenda, we're going to hear from Ledge Council in terms of what their needs are if they are to move to 2 Aiken and 4 Aiken, what their needs are and what Joint Fiscal's needs are, because we have to be aware of that if we're going to move people to a different location. So all of those are going to be addressed here, but let's finish the airflow, air quality issue first. And then we can go to the vaccination issue with Michael.
Right.
And then we can go to the operations of Ledge Council. Well, I take that back. To our legal counsel, legislative counsel, and then our operations with my parent, and then our joint fiscal office. So I see 2 hands, Janet and then John.
So I think I've forgotten my question, but I'm going to take a stab at it. It has to do with the air comfort, air quality, this whole question. And I'm trying to understand what it is that we're trying to accomplish by using this override system or whatever it is that we're talking about, or having these, well, I'm not even sure if that's what we're trying to do. Are we trying to make people safe, or are we trying to make them feel okay being in the building? And if it's making them feel okay being in the building, that to me suggests a whole different set of questions than are we trying to make them safe? And so I realize that I don't understand it. So I would love it if somebody would explain what it is. If we look at, to pick a House committee room, we look at a House committee room, we know there are 11 members, we know there are 2 or 3 staff, we want to have room for 10 people in there. Are we trying to make it safe for that number of people? Or are we trying to get to a place where we can encourage people to feel that they're in good hands somehow. I just don't know what we're trying to do.
I think that's a good way of explaining it, and I don't have an answer to that, but it may be an individual feeling.
But what's our job?
Right.
And not, what is our goal here? And then once I understand a little better what our job is, it's a little easier for me to think about what the different decisions are that we have to make.
So in my mind, air quality goes to safety, airflow goes more to comfort. And we have buildings.
Yeah, can I stop you for a second?
Sure.
Because you and Joe have both used the word comfort. Are you talking about comfort in the sense of, I feel okay being here? Or are you talking about comfort
Well,
in
I
the
would-
sense of
well,
it's not too hot or not
You
too
were asking
cold?
me to delineate, so I just want to make it very clear. Air quality, right? That is something where there are regulations that are placed by VDH on certain constituents in the air. That's sort of one part of the conversation. Airflow and air quality are different things. We have buildings like 2 in Fort Eakin, for example, that have no airflow whatsoever. I'm guessing the Pink Lady is similar as well, right? They're older buildings. There's no ventilation, there's no this type of ventilation in a building like this, right? They're still healthy buildings. People go in and work in them all the time. So again, I just want to make sure we're having the right conversations about what we're talking about, either air quality or air flows. And there are no standards that the state of Vermont has adopted around air flows. You could take that whole analysis, throw it out the door, right? You don't need to follow it. There's nothing that's making you follow it. And you've had the systems in place since the 70s and 80s, and you've been working in these committees all along. So the nice thing about the Senate is they just have the ability, because they have the VAV boxes, to bring in more fresh air, which in theory, if we were using ASHRAE and you decided you wanted to apply that best practice, would be to say, okay, we're going to have 20 people in this room. Under normal circumstances, you can go up to 15 applying this best practice. But we're going to have 20. So we're going to add more fresh air into the room to get to the 20. Now, as Tay said before, you're going to be in the middle of the winter. You're going to be bringing in a lot more cold air when you do that. It's going to be cold in those rooms. And it's going to be dry because the winter air is dry. So then you're going to get like dry skin, kind of itchy eyes. And so everything with air needs to be properly balanced is a good way to say it, right? The humidity in the air, different things like that, the temperature in the air has to be carefully balanced. So there's trade-offs to everything that you do.
So my follow-up is still trying to understand what you mean by comfort. Are you talking about people being comfortable coming in the building, or are you talking about people being comfortable with the hot and cold as they're sitting in the building? What do you mean by comfort?
Senator Benning on that one, because I'm not going to.
Please use that term. I'll ask you.
It's really important that we not conflate comfort with safety. Comfort is a mental feeling when you go into the building. You say, I'm okay in here.
That's how you're used.
Breathing fine here. I'm okay. We have airflow that can be measured to try to get you to feel comfortable when you are sitting in a room like this one. What we don't have, and this is important, is any kind of a safety study that says air quality is bad in room X. Had them, we have remediated that. But presently, our conversation should not be focused on air quality, which is a safety issue, because we don't have any evidence right now that there is a safety issue in any of these rooms. We have COVID that we're coming out of. And I don't mean to belittle the fact that COVID is there. In fact, I've said repeatedly, if COVID rears its head, we have a responsibility to vacate the building and go back to remote. I think that's the only thing we can do. But if we get enmeshed in trying to get to safety concerns, when we don't have any report that there is a safety problem, that gets us all into trouble and into a conversation we're never going to solve.
Seems like comfort is more subjective. Everybody has a
It
different
is.
comfort level.
I can think of it in two different ways. And I was trying to understand how I
Yeah.
was using it.
No, it's a good question.
But I think you laid out a good question, Janet, in terms of what's our goal? Is it to make people feel okay in the building? Or is it to make people feel safe in the building? I think that could be what we keep coming back to as a committee to start answering that questions. We have a few more questions, John, and then Allison.
I was just going to observe that the air quality in the building has been characterized a couple of times as unhealthy. I think we should avoid that because when we know it's unhealthy, we have dealt with it. I think that it's more accurate to say that it doesn't meet contemporary standards, and we want to fix that. My question, though, is when we renovate, are we going to, I'm assuming that we are going to try to reach contemporary standards. Is that our goal?
That is the goal.
Yeah.
But part of that goal is how many do I plan for in a room? So we're going to take our best educated guess. And as soon as you go over that number, CO2 levels could rise, or the system is over designed a little bit to handle one or two additional people in the room. But you can't design for everything. But
You're not going to have a perfect world.
So I guess where I'm going with that is we've acknowledged that we need better airflow. We are working on a plan to reach contemporary standards. We know we're not going to be there next January or even the January after that. So I think the next step, we can maybe leave that and move on to what we're going to do moving forward in the interim, because we know we want to reach that goal. We've already agreed on that, I think.
It's how do we approach it for January?
Right. So I guess what I'm saying is why are we still talking about HVAC? I'm with Joe on this, I guess.
I apologize for talking a lot, but I literally used my committee at the end of the year to dive into all of these questions. And one of the first things that I noticed was BGS has a vernacular that most of us do not understand. And translating that, I'm not trying to disparage you. I'm saying it's a science. You go to school for that. We don't. We have a different view of things. And I say this to juries all the time. Some of you can cook a souffle. I love to eat a souffle. I can't cook to save my life. So I go to somebody who can. These folks have that expertise. Our job as a committee is to try to translate that to our own colleagues who don't have that expertise. So it's really critical that all of us are on the same page with a common understanding of what the language is we have to use going forward. And I apologize. I know I've been talking to you.
I'm going to move this along, okay, because I want to get to the vaccination piece.
I agree. Having raised the vaccination piece initially, I am all over that. But I guess I'd like to go back to some of Janet's question, because I would assume, like I think almost anybody, that there is some impact on airflow on air quality. So I have always assumed that airflow impacted air quality. I mean, I know they're separate, but don't they have impact on each other?
Well, if you don't have enough airflow eventually, and you have too many people in a room for however long, so it depends on the number that you're over, how long you're in the room, but right, we breathe in oxygen and we put out carbon dioxide.
Right.
So as more people go into the room and the longer you're in the room, right, and you don't have adequate airflow, then you're going to have greater amounts of carbon dioxide in the air, and that makes you essentially feel sleepy.
As does a big lunch.
As does a big lunch. That is.
Or even a little lunch.
Boring topic that members aren't interested in.
But I guess the point I'm trying to make though too is that we have buildings underneath our jurisdiction that have absolutely no airflow whatsoever.
I get that, but then one would assume that there was some impact on the air quality.
Well,
you can open the window. There's certain things you can do, but even though if you had adequate air flows, you can still have an air quality issue.
Right.
Yes. And that's how we got mold.
Ruth, do you have a quick question? Because I want to move on to vaccinations with Michael O'Grady.
Just one quick thing, which I think your distinction is really important, Representative Ansel. And I think that the minimum we need to do for next session is safety, that we have to have a safe building. We're required by law. And then we want to make as many people as possible comfortable, but we're not going to be able to make everybody comfortable. And the first people we need to make comfortable are the people that have to be in the building. And then other people can make a choice as to whether they come or not.
Right. Well said.
So
Nice.
with that said, let's move on to Michael O'Grady with the vaccination piece. In terms, I asked him, can we, as a legislative branch, as a branch of government, say, if you're not vaccinated, you cannot come into the building? So Michael, I'm turning it to you. If you've done the work or not, I'm not sure. You muted? You're muted.
Sorry. This is a difficult question, and it's one that Jen Carvey has been looking into more specifically than I have. But I'm just going to give you kind of a framework with the caveat that we have to come back to you with more analysis. So what you're dealing with are two different categories of entities that use the State House. Those that are constitutionally elected officers, legislators like yourself, and those who are not. And legislators have an oath that they need to fulfill, and powers that they can exercise underneath the Constitution in the fulfillment of their duty, including being petitioned by constituents to redress grievances. In addition, the Constitution provides that the legislature is the only entity that can pass on the qualifications of the legislators themselves. So you have to balance what constitutional authority / right that an elected official has to access the building to perform their duties. And if you are going to put conditions on that, then you need to do that through the specific body that has control over the specific legislator. So the House rules would have to adopt it for House rules, and Senate rules would have to adopt it for Senate rules. You have, in the past, the legislature imposed conditions on certain legislators fulfilling their duties, not being on committees, not being allowed to participate. It has been done, so it's not unprecedented. But for the terms of legislators, I think you need to look to the rules and confer with the House clerk and the Senate secretary about what they would believe the best mechanism would be for conditions on legislators, because they are constitutional entities subject to review by each individual body. Now, everyone else, they're members of the public, including the employees using a public building, and according to the provisions of the State House rules and BGS guidance for use of public buildings. I believe if you wanted to implement conditions on people using the State House, you could implement conditions on that. You will need to balance those conditions against the constitutional provision of the open doors policy, which requires the doors of the State House to be open unless public welfare requires them to be closed. So there's some consideration that needs to be taken into account for what you would consider to be a condition that would allow a member of the public access to the State House. I can use the courts as an example. They are allowing people to access state court buildings without a vaccination, provided that they are masked and that any person that is going unmasked is presumed to be vaccinated and is presumed to be attesting to the fact that they were vaccinated. I'm not saying that that's a standard you have to adopt or should adopt, but it's an example of a condition that you can place on the use of the public by a state building. So we need to follow up a little bit more about that balance on the constitutional rights and what authority, if any, what conditions, if any, that the rules committees can place on legislators accessing the State House.
So Michael, when we're talking about the public, we would also be including our legislative council staff, our joint fiscal staff.
I think if you want to place conditions on your staff, I think you can. They don't, they're not, I believe you have the authority to implement public health measures, both under the rules that the Sergeant at Arms has for conditions on use of the State House and for personnel policies under the different personnel policies. I don't think you can require somebody to be vaccinated. I think there are people that are going to have either religious or moral or health reasons for not being vaccinated. And therefore, I think you may have to have mitigation measures or remedial measures for those people that are not vaccinated.
Janet?
So I appreciate the analysis and the fact that there may be different rules for different groups of people. I just want to say at the outset that as a policy, I hope we don't go down the road of requiring vaccinations for people who come in the building. I think it's a bad idea. And can't give you a whole lot of analysis behind that. I don't like it. So I'll just get it out there.
Other folks? Not now.
Well,
Allison?
I'll just play devil's advocate to that, because I think if you go to people's comfort level, Janet, I think people will feel far more comfortable if they know everybody's been vaccinated. And the other thing I think it will enable, and I agree, requiring it is going to be would be a challenge. But I think people's comfort level would be higher, and we could fit more people in if you knew that they were vaccinated. I mean, healthier people together, I mean, I think we could have different physical arrangements if we all knew everybody had been vaccinated. I mean, I think it's a different ballgame.
So understand, I think it would be great if everybody was. I think encouraging people is fine. I am. But there are people who don't want to be vaccinated. They're going to feel very uncomfortable about being told that they can't come into a building, which belongs to them in a sense. And I just, as I said, as a matter of policy, I think it's a bad idea.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
Anthony?
Just to finish that thought, I mean, how do we feel about requiring people to wear masks if they're not vaccinated? Which raises the question, how do you know?
And how do you know?
But I just wonder, it seems like requiring vaccinations is a pretty steep hill to climb.
Yeah.
And I don't like the idea either, but I wish we could require or somehow know that people who are not vaccinated are wearing masks. But I also think people would be wearing masks, and if they're not vaccinated, you wear a mask to protect yourself more than you are to protect me because I'm vaccinated. So I think I agree with what you're saying about vaccinations, but I think it raises the question of masking.
Yeah, I agree with Senator Polina. I think that having what Michael was saying, that requirement that the courthouses are instituting, that, if you're not vaccinated, you're required to wear a mask. And if you're unmasked, the presumption is that you're vaccinated and you're attesting to it or something like that. I like that. And I also think we really should encourage vaccinations and say, as a legislature, we're encouraging you to be fully vaccinated before you come into this public building for your own safety and the safety of others in the building. And that, that's been kind of the state message all along, is that we're all in this community together and we've done a great job and let's keep it up. And we want to make sure that our state house is as safe and comfortable as possible for everyone. And I think that goes toward the encouraging vaccinations and masking. And you're right, there are people who, I think because we've gotten more comfortable with masking, will do it anyway if they have, a bad cold or something like that. And whereas previously we might not have felt comfortable doing that.
Right, because masks obviously are not mandated anymore, but you walk around Montpelier, there's still some people wearing masks.
Yeah.
And they're really effective. I mean, other diseases, we didn't have, people weren't as sick this year because everybody was wearing masks.
Any other questions or comments on the vaccination piece? Because what I'd like to do is take a break before we shift gears to talking about legislative council needs, legislative operation needs, and joint fiscal needs. Anything else on vaccination? Here. John and then Butch.
I think I would just say, I feel compelled to protect those who cannot be vaccinated rather than those who choose not to. And how do we do that? Because there are people who just, you can't do it. It's not going to work. Compromise people. Those people cannot be. And I think we need to really strive to protect them. And I'll just add, what I've heard about wearing a mask is it really helps if you are sick and shedding to keep from spreading to others, but that they're not particularly effective to protect you from others who might be infected. I don't know if I can't cite the data on that, but I've heard that's the case.
I think that's true. I don't think that's true. They work both ways.
Well, to some extent, but I've heard that they're most effective if you are sick, shedding virus.
Right.
Butch?
So requiring vaccinations for members might be acceptable. Some folks might not be, but for the general public, I just couldn't say that we could do that. It's just, it no longer lets the people's house be the people's house. They'll make individual decisions by themselves to come into the building. Members are a different story. As Mike explained, each body would have to make their own rules, but, and I would hesitate even requiring members to be vaccinated. The masking piece is a much larger question for me, and I would not want to even come to any kind of consensus currently until we have a little bit of thought on that. But that's another tough, very difficult question.
Maybe the thought is everybody wears a mask.
Yeah.
Because if you're sitting around your committee and you got two people wearing a mask, it's kind of putting a label on them.
Yeah.
Joe?
I don't know how much progress we can make today. Feeling pressed for time because I'm not going to be here next week. I've noticed that we have gained bad press already on this subject. And if there's a way to solidify this conversation and say, come to consensus that we should not require people to be vaccinated. Encouraged, yes. Encouraged to wear a mask if that person feels it's appropriate or if they have a problem, fine. But bad press, the optics of that, this committee, a lot of other things to cover, I was really taken back by. So there'll be press watching this conversation. I'm sort of hoping if there's a way to make a motion or at least understand that that's our consensus.
Are people comfortable with making some preliminary decision on the vaccination piece? So I would entertain a motion.
Sure, exactly what it would say, what Joe said.
Well, and also Mike hadn't finished his research. I believe Mike said that he still hadn't finished all the work on it. Is that right?
So if I could jump in, the reason I jumped in is I don't care what the research shows. I still think it's a bad idea. So if we decide to pursue a mandatory vaccination policy, which I would oppose, then Mike's research is relevant. But if we're not going down that road, it's interesting, but not going to change my mind.
So I guess the question is, would we be comfortable support doing as the courts are doing? That we would presume that if you were not vaccinated, we would ask you to wear a mask. There's that presumption there.
Well, I think that the added thing on what the courts are doing is that if you're not wearing a mask, you're attesting to the fact that you have been, and that's a sort of added.
That's a pretty big question. I think that we need to have some more conversation.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd like to understand what that means.
Vaccination question is one thing.
Yeah.
I think I feel some consensus around the table, but the masking piece is a much larger discussion, I think, that we need to have.
And so I guess I just want to make sure that what I would like, I hear you about not requiring it, and I'm not going to pick that battle. I'm really not. But I really want to strongly encourage it. Like I want language that says, we strongly encourage you. It's the socially responsible. It's the public health responsible. It's the thing we've all been working for the past 15, 16 months. And so if we're going to say we're not going to require it, I want there to be a statement that goes along with that we're strongly encouraging it.
I would agree.
Other folks?
Just on the vaccination.
On the vaccinations, and the masking thing can be another conversation once Michael has more information. I'm willing to wait on that and talk about the subtleties about it, but I just want to be clear on the.
Gotcha.
Make a motion. This committee recommend to Appropriate Rules Committee, JLMC, that we strongly encourage people to be vaccinated prior to entering the State House, but we will not require.
So it's been moved.
Move it.
Second. Butch? Discussion.
Is that members and the public, everyone?
My motion is for everyone.
Entering.
Any further discussion of the motion?
My further question is, I assume at some point we'll discuss the masking piece.
Yes, this is just the question of a requirement of vaccinations or not, that we would strongly encourage people entering the State House that they are vaccinated, but we are not mandating that people need to be vaccinated.
Somebody writing that down, or did I need to write that down?
Now, somebody's got to write this down.
BGS.
I have.
Hard to take
Yes.
notes. This is an important motion, and what I would like to do is, David, are you sort of our clerk? I would like to.
I am.
I would like.
I'm an old-fashioned kind of clerk.
Why are we not surprised?
So I would like to call the roll of the members.
Did someone second?
Yes, Butch.
Who was that?
Butch.
Okay.
Did you move it, Chuck?
Yeah, so it's been moved and seconded that we would strongly encourage that people entering the State House session or whenever.
Whenever.
I think whenever.
That we'd strongly encourage that people are vaccinated. We are not mandating any vaccinations. We're not mandated.
We're not going to recommend
We're
it.
not going to recommend that
They be
the public
mandatory.
needs to be vaccinated to enter the State House.
Let anyone be vaccinated to enter. And we'll fine tune it later.
Right. That's our overarching. Any further discussion before we take a vote? So, David, could you call the roll for the members?
Yes. Senator Emmons.
I go last.
Oh,
Here's the-
Senator,
Classic, might not.
Senator Benning.
Yes.
Senator Clarkson.
Yeah.
Senator Polina.
Yes.
Senator Hardy.
Yes.
Representative Ansel.
Yes.
Representative Bartholomew.
No, it goes against all my veterinary training about epidemiology and herd immunity.
Right.
But I will vote yes anyway.
So the most qualified yes we're going to get.
All right. I won't put that in the minutes. Representative Shaw.
Yes.
Janet Miller. John Dumville.
Yes.
Jennifer Fitch.
Well, you guys are putting me in a sticky wicket here because we are not requiring people to be vaccinated to come into state buildings. However, the governor does encourage people to get their vaccinations. So it's a really tricky one for me. I'm not opposed. Can I say that?
Well, that's what we're doing. That's
You
what
can
we said.
abstain.
That's exactly what we said, though, Jennifer.
Yeah, that's what the motion is.
The motion is exactly what you just
That's
said,
what it is. You're encouraged.
that we strongly encourage it but not require it.
All right. And I'm gonna vote yes.
I'm totally with you. That's exactly what it
Okay.
is. Yeah.
11.
Karen Middleman. Not here. And Steve Perkins. Not here.
Or is he in Zoom world?
Is Steve Perkins here? No. Okay.
Can I say two things because I will not be here next week? Should you get into,
I need to vote.
Yeah,
I need
we're not
to
done.
Oh,
Don't talk, you have to go back to the beginning.
Madam Chair.
I mean, Representative Emmons.
Yes. So the results of the vote are 11 in favor, 0 opposed, and 3 absent.
We had 13.
so two quick things. I'm not going to be here next week. I want to say thank you that we've made some progress. This is the kind of baby step thing we have to do. The second thing is when you get to the conversation of masks, I wanted you to know that last Thursday night, I had a conversation with an elderly House member who is not able to be vaccinated for medical reasons and had
Right.
tears in her eyes
Yep.
because she was concerned she was not going to be able to come back as a legislator. I think when you require masks, that people are then identified as ill for some reason. That's the image that's going to be presented, and I would strongly encourage us not to go in that direction. That's all.
So with that being said, let's take a break, folks, because we've been sitting here for an hour and a half.
Take some rest.
And I have a hunch we're going to go over the 4 o'clock till.
There's gonna be some rest.